In a world where power is measured by rank and privilege, where women are expected to bow their heads and accept their fate, one young woman's greatest humiliation became the catalyst for her extraordinary rise. This is not just another story of overcoming adversity. This is the true account of how a moment of cruel degradation transformed into an act of defiance that would shake the very foundations of military hierarchy. What happens when those who seek to break your spirit unknowingly forge your strength? When the very act meant to destroy your dignity becomes the spark that ignites your destiny? Sometimes, the darkest moments in our lives are not endings, but beginnings we never saw coming. This is the story of Maria Santos, a woman whose hair was shorn in shame, only to discover that her true power had nothing to do with what covered her head, and everything to do with what filled her heart. In 5 extraordinary chapters, witness how humiliation became honor, how weakness became strength, and how a general's unexpected intervention changed not just one life, but an entire military tradition. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about courage, justice, and the price of standing up for what's right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Maria Santos walked toward the administration building, her dark hair braided neatly down her back. She had spent 3 years working as a civilian contractor on the base, earning respect through her dedication and intelligence. At 26, she had carved out a small but significant role in the communications department, translating intercepted messages and providing crucial intelligence support to the military operations. Maria's colleagues knew her as someone who never backed down from a challenge. She had grown up in a small village where resources were scarce, and opportunities even scarcer. Her father had been a mechanic who taught her that hard work was the only currency that truly mattered. Her mother, a schoolteacher, had instilled in her the belief that knowledge was power that no one could take away. These lessons had shaped Maria into a woman who faced each day with quiet determination. The base where she worked was a hub of activity, with soldiers and civilians working together to support regional security operations. While she was not military personnel herself, Maria had earned the respect of many officers and enlisted personnel through her exceptional work. She spoke 4 languages fluently and had an uncanny ability to detect patterns in communications that others missed. Her supervisor, Colonel Anderson, had often praised her contributions in staff meetings. However, not everyone appreciated Maria's presence or her success. A group of officers led by Major Bradley Thompson had always resented the influence that civilians, particularly women, seemed to have in military operations. Thompson was a career military man who believed that tradition and hierarchy should never be compromised. He saw Maria's growing reputation as a threat to what he considered the proper order of things. Thompson had been looking for an opportunity to put Maria in what he considered her rightful place. That opportunity came when a minor security breach occurred in the communications department. While the investigation ultimately showed that the breach had nothing to do with Maria's work, Thompson saw his chance to act. On that fateful Tuesday morning, Maria arrived at work to find her access card deactivated. When she inquired at the security desk, she was told to report to Major Thompson's office immediately. Confused but not alarmed, she made her way through the familiar corridors of the building she had called her workplace for 3 years. Thompson's office was located in the eastern wing of the building, an area that housed the military personnel officers. As Maria approached, she noticed several soldiers gathered in the hallway, their expressions unreadable. Something felt different about the atmosphere, but she couldn't quite place what it was. When she knocked on Thompson's door, his gruff voice called her to enter. The office was spartanly decorated, with military awards and commendations covering one wall and a large desk dominating the center of the room. Thompson sat behind his desk, his uniform immaculate and his expression stern. Standing beside him were 2 other officers she recognized but had never worked with directly. "Miss Santos," Thompson began, his voice carrying an edge of authority that seemed more pronounced than usual. "We need to discuss your role in the recent security incident." Maria's heart quickened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Major Thompson, I was told that the investigation cleared me of any involvement in the breach. My supervisor, Colonel Anderson, confirmed this yesterday." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Colonel Anderson may be satisfied with the investigation, but I am not. The fact remains that this breach occurred in your department, and as someone with access to sensitive information, you represent a potential security risk." The accusation hit Maria like a physical blow. In 3 years of dedicated service, her loyalty had never been questioned. She had worked overtime countless times, had volunteered for additional training, and had consistently produced work that exceeded expectations. The suggestion that she was somehow unreliable or untrustworthy was both shocking and deeply hurtful. "Sir," With respect, my record speaks for itself. I have never compromised security protocols, and my clearance reviews have always been exemplary. If there are specific concerns about my work, I would appreciate the opportunity to address them directly. Thompson stood up from his desk, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. Ms. Santos, you seem to have forgotten your place here. You are a civilian contractor, nothing more. Your opinions about security protocols are neither requested nor valued. The other two officers exchanged glances, and Maria could see something in their expressions that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. This was not a routine meeting about security procedures. Something else was happening here, something that went beyond any legitimate concerns about her work. I want you to understand something very clearly, Thompson continued, walking around his desk to stand directly in front of her. This is a military installation, operated according to military standards and military traditions. Civilians who work here do so at our discretion and under our rules. Maria felt her pulse racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. Major, I understand the chain of command and the military structure. I have always operated within the guidelines established for civilian contractors. Thompson smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Guidelines can change, Miss Santos. Privileges can be revoked. And sometimes, people need to be reminded of their proper place in the hierarchy. It was at that moment that Maria realized this encounter was not about security breaches or protocols. This was personal. Thompson's resentment of her position, her success, and perhaps her very presence on the base had finally found an outlet. One of the other officers, Captain Mills, stepped forward with what appeared to be a set of electric hair clippers in his hand. The sight of the device sent a chill down Maria's spine, and she instinctively took a step backward. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice betraying the first hint of real fear she had felt since entering the office. Thompson's smile widened. "Miss Santos, it has come to our attention that your appearance does not conform to military standards. While civilian contractors are not technically subject to military grooming regulations, we have decided that anyone working in sensitive positions should adhere to military appearance standards." Maria's hand instinctively went to her hair, the long braid that had been part of her identity since childhood. "This is completely inappropriate, Major. You have no authority to dictate my personal appearance." "Actually," Thompson said, pulling out a folder from his desk, "according to Clause 7 of your contract, civilian contractors can be subject to additional security requirements as deemed necessary by the commanding authority. I am invoking that clause." Maria's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. She knew her contract well, and while there were provisions for additional security measures, they typically involve things like background checks or access restrictions, not personal grooming requirements. "I want to speak with Colonel Anderson," she said firmly. "This is beyond your authority and you know it." Thompson's expression hardened. "Colonel Anderson is currently off base on assignment. In his absence, I have been granted authority over civilian contractor management. You can speak with him when he returns, but for now, you will comply with my directive." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Maria realized that she was facing a choice that would define not just her career, but her sense of self-worth and dignity. She could submit to this obvious abuse of power, or she could stand her ground and face whatever consequences Thompson had in mind. "I will not submit to this humiliation," she said quietly but firmly. "You are using your position to abuse your authority, and I will not be a party to it." Thompson's face flushed with anger. "Miss Santos, you seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter. You do not. You will submit to the required grooming standards, or you will be removed from this installation for failure to comply with security directives." The threat hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Maria knew that being removed from the base would effectively end her career in intelligence work. She had built her entire professional life around her position here, and starting over elsewhere would be nearly impossible without the security clearance and experience she had gained. But as she looked at Thompson's satisfied expression and the expectant faces of the other officers, she realized that submitting to this degradation would be even more devastating than losing her job. This was not about grooming standards or security requirements. This was about power, control, and putting a woman who had dared to excel in her proper place. Captain Mills stepped forward with the clippers, clearly expecting her to acquiesce. The sound of the device being switched on filled the room with an ominous buzzing that seemed to echo off the walls. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of her parents and the values they had instilled in her. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her ear. "Sometimes, standing up for yourself is more important than protecting what you think you have." Her mother's lessons about dignity and self-respect flooded back to her. When she opened her eyes, she looked directly at Thompson. "Do what you feel you must do, Major. But understand that this changes nothing about who I am or what I am capable of. You may be able to cut my hair, but you cannot cut my spirit or my determination." Thompson's eyes flashed with something that might have been respect, quickly replaced by cold determination. "Hold her arms," he instructed the other officers. As the two men moved to restrain her, Maria made one final statement that would echo in that room long after she left it. "History will remember this moment, Major Thompson, not because you had the power to humiliate me, but because you chose to use it. That choice says everything about who you are and nothing about who I am." The buzzing of the clippers grew louder as Captain Mills approached her from behind. Maria stood as straight as she could, her chin raised and her eyes fixed on Thompson's face. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The first pass of the clippers through her hair sent dark strands falling to the floor around her feet. Each subsequent pass took away more of what she had considered part of her identity. But with each fallen strand, something else seemed to grow stronger inside her. As her hair fell away, Maria felt a strange transformation beginning to take place. The humiliation that Thompson intended to crush her spirit was instead clarifying her resolve. She began to understand that her true strength had never resided in her appearance or in the approval of men like Thompson. It came from something much deeper and more enduring. The process seemed to take forever, but eventually, the buzzing stopped. Maria's reflection in the window showed a woman she hardly recognized, her head nearly shaved, her scalp visible beneath the stubble that remained. Thompson seemed somewhat taken aback by her composed demeanor. Perhaps he had expected tears or pleas for mercy. Instead, he found himself facing a woman whose dignity remained intact despite his attempts to strip it away. "You are hereby suspended pending a full review of your security status," Thompson announced, his voice lacking some of the confidence it had carried earlier. "You have 1 hour to clear out your desk and leave the premises." Maria nodded calmly. "I understand, Major. Is there anything else you require?" The question seemed to catch Thompson off guard. He had expected her to be broken, defeated, perhaps even grateful for being allowed to keep her job under different circumstances. Instead, she was treating this like a routine administrative matter. "No," he said after a moment. "That will be all." Maria turned and walked toward the door with measured steps. As she reached for the handle, she paused and looked back at the three men who had just participated in her humiliation. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "I want you to remember this day. Remember what you did and why you did it. Because someday, when you look back on your careers and your lives, you will have to reconcile this moment with whatever other good you think you have accomplished." She left Thompson's office with her head held high, walking through the corridors where colleagues and friends watched her pass in stunned silence. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the building, and by the time she reached her desk, a small crowd had gathered. Some looked at her with pity, others with shock, but a few, particularly some of the younger women on staff, looked at her with something that resembled admiration. She had faced down abuse of power and maintained her dignity in circumstances that would have broken many others. As Maria packed her personal belongings into a small cardboard box, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. She had always believed that hard work and competence would be enough to protect her from the prejudices and small-mindedness of people like Thompson. Today had taught her that sometimes the world demands more than competence. Sometimes it demands courage. The drive home from the base felt like a journey through a different world. Everything looked the same, but Maria felt fundamentally changed by the morning's events. She was unemployed, publicly humiliated, and facing an uncertain future. Yet beneath the natural anxiety about practical concerns, she felt something unexpected, a sense of liberation. For 3 years she had worked within a system that she now realized had never truly accepted her. She had modified her behavior, tempered her opinions, and carefully navigated the unspoken rules that governed life on a military base. Today, those careful accommodations had proven worthless in the face of Thompson's determined prejudice. But in losing her job, she had gained something valuable: absolute clarity about her own values and priorities. She would no longer spend energy trying to fit into spaces that did not want her. Instead, she would focus on finding or creating environments where her talents could flourish without compromise. That evening, Maria sat in her small apartment, running her hand over her shorn scalp. The sensation was strange and new, but not unpleasant. She had spent so many years defining herself partly through her appearance, but now she was forced to find her identity in other qualities. She thought about calling her parents to tell them what had happened, but decided to wait. She wanted to process the day's events fully before trying to explain them to anyone else. Besides, she had a feeling that this story was far from over. As night fell over the city, Maria Santos sat in the darkness of her apartment and began to plan her next move. She had been humiliated, but she had not been defeated. In fact, she was beginning to suspect that Thompson's attempt to destroy her may have inadvertently set her free. The phone rang around 10 o'clock, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed Colonel Anderson's number, and Maria hesitated before answering. She respected Anderson and had enjoyed working under his supervision, but she was not ready to discuss returning to work under the current circumstances. Maria. Anderson's voice was tight with anger. I just heard about what happened today. I am appalled and deeply sorry that you were subjected to such treatment. Colonel Anderson, Maria replied carefully, I appreciate your call, but I think it's best if we don't discuss the details right now. Maria, I want you to know that what Thompson did was completely outside the bounds of his authority. I am flying back tomorrow to address this situation directly. For the first time since leaving the base, Maria felt her composure waver slightly. Anderson's obvious distress on her behalf was touching, but it also reminded her of how alone she had felt during the ordeal with Thompson. I understand that you're upset, Colonel, but I'm not sure what can be done at this point. Major Thompson made it clear that he considers my presence on the base to be incompatible with military standards. Thompson was way out of line, and he's going to answer for it, Anderson said firmly. But more importantly, I want you to know that your work and your character have never been in question with anyone who matters. After ending the call with Anderson, Maria felt a complex mix of emotions. It was gratifying to know that her supervisor supported her, but it also highlighted the arbitrary nature of the power that had been used against her. Thompson's opinions about her worth and place carried weight simply because of his rank, regardless of their validity or fairness. As she prepared for bed that night, Maria caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The image was still startling, but she was beginning to see something different in her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed stronger somehow, as if the removal of her hair had revealed something that had always been there, but had been hidden. She touched her scalp gently, remembering the weight of the braid that had hung down her back for so many years. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of rebuilding her life and her career. She would face whatever challenges awaited her with the same dignity she had maintained in Thompson's office. But tonight, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for her lost job or her shorn hair, but for the innocence that had been stripped away along with everything else. She had learned that competence and good intentions were not always enough to protect against the abuse of power. It was a hard lesson, but one that would serve her well in the battles that lay ahead. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria Santos had no idea that her story was about to take a turn that would transform her personal tragedy into something much larger and more significant. The humiliation she had endured would soon become the catalyst for changes that would reach far beyond her own life and career. The next phase of her journey was about to begin, and it would test everything she thought she knew about justice, courage, and the price of standing up for what is right. The morning after her humiliation, Maria woke to the sound of her phone ringing incessantly. News of what had happened to her had spread beyond the military base overnight, reaching friends, former colleagues, and even local news outlets. The story of a civilian contractor having her head forcibly shaved by military officers was the kind of tale that captured public attention and sparked outrage. Maria let most of the calls go to voicemail, but when she saw her former college roommate Sarah's number, she decided to answer. Sarah worked as a paralegal at a civil rights law firm and had been encouraging Maria for years to be more assertive about workplace discrimination. Maria, I cannot believe what I'm hearing. Sarah's voice was filled with indignation. Please tell me you're planning to take legal action against these people. I don't know what I'm planning yet, Maria replied honestly. Yesterday feels like it happened to someone else. I'm still trying to process everything. Well, you need to process faster, Sarah said bluntly. My boss wants to represent you pro bono. This is exactly the kind of case our firm exists to handle. What Thompson did wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. After hanging up with Sarah, Maria found herself facing a decision she hadn't expected to confront so soon. Taking legal action would mean prolonging her association with the incident, keeping it in the public eye, and potentially facing months or years of legal battles. But it would also mean standing up not just for herself, but for others who might face similar treatment in the future. Before she could make any decisions about lawyers or lawsuits, Colonel Anderson called again. His voice carried an urgency that immediately got her attention. Maria, I need you to come to the base this morning. General Patricia Hayes is flying in from headquarters to conduct a personal investigation into what happened. She wants to speak with you directly. General Hayes was a name Maria recognized but had never expected to encounter personally. She was one of the highest-ranking women in the military, known for her brilliant tactical mind and her unwavering commitment to military excellence. She was also known for having little tolerance for incompetence or abuse of authority. "Colonel, I'm not sure I'm ready to return to the base, even for a meeting," Maria said carefully. "Yesterday was incredibly traumatic, and I'm not sure I can handle being back in that environment so soon." "I understand your hesitation," Anderson replied. "But General Hayes specifically requested to meet with you, and she's not someone who makes such requests lightly. She's known for her fairness and her commitment to justice. If anyone can address what happened to you properly, it's her." Maria spent the next hour getting ready for what felt like the most important meeting of her life. She chose her clothes carefully, settling on a conservative business suit that projected professionalism and competence. As she prepared to cover her shaved head with a scarf, she paused and made a decision that surprised even her. She would meet General Hayes without any covering, allowing her shorn scalp to serve as visible evidence of what had been done to her. The drive back to the military base felt surreal. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had left this place as a humiliated and suspended civilian contractor. Now she was returning to meet with one of the most powerful people in the military hierarchy, someone who could potentially change the entire narrative of her experience. At the base entrance, the security guards treated her with unusual deference. Clearly aware that her meeting with General Hayes gave her a temporary but significant status, as she drove through the familiar gates, Maria felt a complex mix of emotions. This place had been her professional home for 3 years, but yesterday's events had fundamentally altered her relationship with it. Colonel Anderson met her at the entrance to the administration building, his expression a mixture of anger and concern. He had clearly been deeply affected by what had happened to her, and his usual military composure seemed strained. "Maria, before we go in, I want you to know that I've already begun my own investigation into Thompson's actions. What he did was completely unauthorized and violated multiple regulations regarding the treatment of civilian personnel." "I appreciate that, Colonel, but I'm not sure what good an internal investigation will do." Thompson believed he had the authority to do what he did, and apparently no one was in a position to stop him. Anderson's jaw tightened. Thompson's interpretation of his authority was completely incorrect. No military officer has the right to dictate the personal appearance of civilian contractors, regardless of any security concerns. What he did was personal retaliation, pure and simple. They walked through corridors that Maria knew well, past offices where she had worked, and conference rooms where she had contributed to important briefings. The familiar environment felt different now, charged with tension and uncertainty. Colleagues and military personnel they passed either avoided eye contact or stared openly at her altered appearance. General Hayes had set up a temporary office in a conference room near the command center. When Anderson knocked on the door, a crisp voice called for them to enter. Maria's first sight of General Hayes was both intimidating and reassuring. She was a woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair cut in a precise military style. Her uniform was immaculate, and her bearing radiated the kind of authority that came from years of commanding respect in difficult circumstances. "Santos," General Hayes said, standing and extending her hand. "Thank you for coming in today. I know this must be difficult for you." As they shook hands, Maria noticed that General Hayes's eyes took in her appearance without flinching or showing pity. There was something in her expression that suggested she was cataloging evidence rather than simply observing damage. "Please, sit down," General Hayes said, gesturing to a chair across from her temporary desk. "Colonel Anderson has briefed me on the basic facts of yesterday's incident, but I want to hear your account directly." Maria took a deep breath and began to recount the events in Thompson's office. She spoke clearly and factually, avoiding emotional language, but not minimizing the impact of what had occurred. General Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Maria finished her account, General Hayes was quiet for several minutes, reviewing her notes and seemingly lost in thought. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, but Maria sensed that rushing to fill it would be a mistake. "Ms. Santos," General Hayes finally said, "what Major Thompson did to you was not just inappropriate. It was a fundamental violation of the principles that should guide military leadership. No officer under my command has the authority to humiliate civilian personnel in the manner you've described." "General Hayes," Maria replied carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure what can be done at this point. The damage has been done, and I've already been suspended from my position." General Hayes leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense. "Ms. Santos, I want you to understand something very clearly. What happened to you reflects poorly on the entire military structure, not on you personally. Major Thompson's actions were those of a man who confused authority with power and leadership with intimidation. The general stood and walked to the window overlooking the base courtyard. I've spent 30 years in military service, and I've seen too many instances where people in positions of authority have used that authority to diminish rather than elevate others. It's a betrayal of everything the military should represent. What does that mean for me? Maria asked. Even if Thompson's actions were wrong, my career here is effectively over. The suspension alone will make it nearly impossible for me to find similar work elsewhere. General Hayes turned back to face her. That's where you're wrong. Ms. Santos, your suspension is hereby lifted, effective immediately. You will be reinstated to your position with full back pay and a formal apology from this command. Maria felt a surge of emotions she wasn't prepared for. Relief, vindication, and gratitude washed over her in waves. But beneath these positive feelings was something more complex. A wariness about simply returning to the status quo after such a traumatic experience. General, I'm grateful for your intervention, but I need to ask, what about Major Thompson? If he's allowed to remain in his position, what's to prevent him from retaliating against me or treating other civilians in a similar manner? General Hayes's expression hardened. Major Thompson is being relieved of his command pending a formal court-martial. His actions constituted conduct unbecoming an officer and abuse of authority. He will face the full consequences of his choices. The news that Thompson would face serious consequences was satisfying, but it also raised new concerns for Maria. She would be returning to an environment where she had been publicly humiliated, working alongside people who had witnessed her degradation. The practical challenges of resuming her career were significant. I understand your hesitation, General Hayes said, seeming to read her thoughts. Returning to work after such an experience won't be easy. But I want you to consider something. Your response to what happened yesterday has already made you a symbol of dignity under pressure. Others are watching to see how this situation is resolved. I'm not sure I wanted to become a symbol, Maria said quietly. I just wanted to do my job well and be treated with basic respect. Sometimes circumstances choose us rather than us choosing them, General Hayes replied. But you have an opportunity here to help ensure that what happened to you doesn't happen to others. Your experience can become a catalyst for positive change. Over the next hour, General Hayes outlined a comprehensive response to the incident. In addition to Thompson's court-martial, there would be a complete review of policies governing the treatment of civilian contractors. New training programs would be implemented to ensure that all military personnel understood the proper boundaries of their authority. Most importantly, a formal complaint process would be established to provide civilian employees with recourse when they face discrimination or abuse. As the meeting continued, Maria began to see her experience in a different light. What had felt like a personal catastrophe was being transformed into an opportunity for systemic change. The humiliation she had endured could serve a larger purpose if it prevented others from facing similar treatment. General Hayes, Maria said as the meeting was winding down, I want to return to work, but I need assurance that the changes you're describing will actually be implemented and enforced. I can't go through this again. You have my personal commitment that these changes will be more than just policy documents gathering dust in filing cabinets. General Hayes replied firmly. I'll be conducting follow-up inspections to ensure compliance, and I'm establishing a direct reporting line for any civilian who feels they're being mistreated. When Maria left the meeting, she felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since the previous day's ordeal. The prospect of returning to work was still daunting, but she was no longer facing it alone. General Hayes had not just offered her justice, she had offered her partnership in creating a better environment for everyone. Colonel Anderson walked her to her car, his relief evident in his more relaxed demeanor. Maria, I want you to know how proud I am of the way you've handled this situation. It would have been easy to just walk away and try to forget what happened. I'm not sure I would have had the courage to fight this without General Hayes's intervention, Maria admitted. Having someone of her stature take the situation seriously changes everything. Don't underestimate your own role in this, Anderson replied. Your dignity and composure in Thompson's office made it impossible for anyone to dismiss what happened as minor incident. You conducted yourself with honor when you were being dishonored. That evening, Maria called her parents to tell them about the day's developments. Her mother cried when she heard about General Hayes's intervention and the promise of justice for Thompson's actions. Her father's response was more measured, but equally emotional. Mija, he said, using the Spanish endearment she remembered from childhood. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things that follow. You've been given a chance to turn your pain into purpose. As Maria prepared for bed that night, she spent time looking at herself in the mirror. Her reflection still showed the visible evidence of her humiliation, but something in her expression had changed. She looked like someone who had been tested and had emerged stronger. The next morning would begin a new chapter in her life and career. She would be returning to the military base not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a professional who had faced down injustice and helped create meaningful change. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. Over the next few days, news of General Hayes' investigation and Thompson's impending court-martial spread throughout the military community. Maria found herself receiving calls and messages from civilian contractors at other installations who had faced similar treatment, but had felt powerless to address it. Her case was becoming a rallying point for broader changes in military-civilian relations. Sarah, her lawyer friend, was both impressed and slightly disappointed by the resolution. "I'm glad you got justice," she said during a phone call. "But part of me wishes we could have made them pay more significantly through the courts. I think the changes General Hayes is implementing will be more valuable in the long run than any financial settlement," Maria replied. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about creating a system that protects everyone." The weekend before her return to work, Maria spent time preparing herself mentally for the challenges ahead. She had chosen to let her hair begin growing back naturally, seeing its gradual return as a symbol of her own recovery and renewal. But she also knew that her colleagues' reactions to her return would be mixed and potentially uncomfortable. Some would see her as a hero who had stood up to abusive authority. Others might view her as a troublemaker who had brought unwanted scrutiny to their workplace. Still others would simply be curious about her experience and eager to hear details she might not be ready to share. On Sunday evening, General Hayes called her personally to check on her preparation for returning to work. It was an unprecedented gesture that underscored the General's personal investment in the success of the broader changes being implemented. "Miss Santos," General Hayes said, "I want you to know that I'll be visiting the base regularly over the next few months to ensure that the new policies are being properly implemented. Your successful reintegration into the workforce is crucial to the credibility of these reforms." "I understand the pressure that puts on me," Maria replied. "I won't let you down, General." "This isn't about letting me down," General Hayes said firmly. "This is about proving that military and civilian personnel can work together with mutual respect and shared purpose. You've already proven your strength. Now you get to prove your resilience." As Maria hung up the phone, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few days. She had gone from being an anonymous civilian contractor to being a symbol of resistance to abusive authority. It was a responsibility she had never sought, but one she was determined to handle with the same dignity that had carried her through the worst moments of her ordeal. The morning of her return to work was approaching, and with it the next phase of a journey that had begun with humiliation, but was evolving into something much more significant. Maria Santos was about to discover that her real strength lay not in her ability to endure hardship, but in her capacity to transform that hardship into positive change for others. Her story was far from over, and the most important chapters were yet to be written. Monday morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill that seemed to mirror the nervous energy coursing through Maria's veins. She had spent the weekend mentally rehearsing this moment, but now that it was here, the reality felt more daunting than any preparation could have addressed. As she drove through the base gates, the familiar security checkpoint took on new significance. The guards who had known her for 3 years now looked at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity that hadn't been there before. Maria had chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue blazer and matching slacks that projected professional competence. She wore no head covering, allowing her slowly growing hair to be visible as a reminder of what she had endured and overcome. The stubble that had replaced her long braid was beginning to show signs of new growth, each millimeter representing her gradual recovery and renewal. The parking lot near the administration building buzzed with more activity than usual. Word of her return had clearly spread throughout the base community, and Maria noticed several groups of people who seemed to be lingering near the building entrance. Some were clearly waiting to see her return, while others appeared to be going about their normal business with unusual awareness of their surroundings. As she walked across the parking lot, Maria felt the weight of dozens of eyes following her progress. The attention was uncomfortable, but she had expected it. Her story had become larger than her personal experience, and her return to work was being watched as a test of whether the military's promises of change would translate into real-world improvements. Colonel Anderson was waiting for her at the building entrance, his presence both welcoming and protective. His decision to personally escort her on her first day back sent a clear message about the command structure's support for her return. "Good morning, Maria," Anderson said, his tone warm but professional. "I'm glad to have you back." "Thank you, Colonel," she replied. "I'm ready to get back to work." As they entered the building, Maria noticed that the atmosphere felt different from what she remembered. Conversations seemed more subdued, and people's interactions appeared more carefully considered. The changes General Hayes had implemented were already having a visible impact on the workplace culture. Walking through the familiar corridors toward her office, Maria encountered a steady stream of colleagues and acquaintances. Their reactions varied significantly, creating a complex emotional landscape for her to navigate. Some offered warm welcomes and expressions of support, clearly viewing her as someone who had stood up for principles that mattered to everyone. Others maintained polite but distant professionalism, perhaps uncertain about how to interact with someone whose experience had created so much institutional upheaval. Maria's office looked exactly as she had left it, with one notable addition: a small bouquet of flowers on her desk with a card signed by several women who worked in various civilian positions throughout the base. The gesture was simple but deeply meaningful, representing solidarity from people who understood the courage her return required. As she settled into her workspace and began reviewing the messages that had accumulated during her suspension, Maria felt a gradual sense of normalcy returning. The familiar routines of checking emails, organizing documents, and preparing for the day's tasks provided a comforting anchor amid the swirling emotions and attention surrounding her return. Her first official meeting of the day was with Colonel Anderson to discuss her role in the ongoing implementation of the new civilian protection policies. General Hayes had specifically requested that Maria be involved in developing training materials and procedures that would prevent future incidents like the one she had experienced. "Maria," Anderson began as they settled into his office, "I want to be clear about something. Your involvement in developing these new policies is completely voluntary. If you prefer to simply return to your regular duties, that's perfectly acceptable." "I appreciate the option, Colonel, but I think I need to be involved," Maria replied. "If I'm going to be a symbol of what happened, I want to have a voice in ensuring it doesn't happen again." Over the next hour, they discussed the specifics of Maria's expanded role. She would be working directly with a team of lawyers and policy experts to develop comprehensive guidelines for military-civilian workplace interactions. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced the worst possible outcome of policy failures would be invaluable in creating effective safeguards. The work would require her to relive aspects of her traumatic experience repeatedly, but it would also give her agency in shaping the response to that trauma. Instead of being merely a victim of circumstance, she would become an architect of positive change. As word of her expanded role spread throughout the base, Maria began receiving visits from other civilian contractors who wanted to share their own experiences with workplace harassment and discrimination. Many had stories that were less dramatic than hers, but equally damaging to their sense of dignity and professional satisfaction. One particularly meaningful conversation came from Janet Rodriguez, a 50-year-old administrative assistant who had worked on the base for over a decade. Janet had faced years of subtle but persistent harassment from a supervisor who made inappropriate comments about her appearance and questioned her competence based on her gender and ethnicity. "I never thought there was anything I could do about it," Janet confided during a private conversation in Maria's office. "He never did anything as obvious as what Thompson did to you. But the daily humiliation was wearing me down. Now, for the first time in years, I feel like there might be real consequences for that kind of behavior." These conversations reinforced Maria's commitment to the policy development work. Her experience had been extreme, but it was part of a larger pattern of abuse that affected many people who lacked the visibility or support to fight back effectively. The first major test of Maria's return came during a staff meeting that included several officers who had been present during or immediately after her humiliation. The meeting was led by Colonel Anderson and focused on the implementation of new training protocols, but the underlying tension was palpable. Captain Mills, who had operated the clippers that removed Maria's hair, was among the attendees. His presence in the room created a surreal atmosphere that tested everyone's professionalism. When Anderson asked Maria to present her preliminary recommendations for the training program, she found herself speaking directly to someone who had participated in her degradation. "The core principle underlying all of these recommendations," Maria said, maintaining steady eye contact with Mills and the other officers present, "is that authority must be exercised with respect for human dignity. When power is used to humiliate rather than to accomplish legitimate objectives, it ceases to be leadership and becomes abuse." Mills shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. His silence was noted by everyone in the room and sent a clear message about how the power dynamics had shifted since Thompson's removal. After the meeting, several officers approached Maria privately to express their discomfort with what had happened to her and their support for the changes being implemented. These conversations revealed that Thompson's actions had troubled many people who had felt powerless to intervene at the time. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a young communications officer, was particularly emotional during her conversation with Maria. "I wanted to say something when I heard what was happening, but I didn't know how to challenge a superior officer. I've been haunted by my inaction ever since." "You weren't responsible for Thompson's choices," Maria assured her. "But now you have clear protocols to follow if something similar ever happens again. That's how we prevent future incidents." As the weeks passed, Maria's role in developing and implementing the new policies grew more substantial. She found herself traveling to other military installations to consult on similar policy changes, sharing her experience as both a cautionary tale and an example of effective institutional response to abuse of authority. The work was emotionally demanding but professionally fulfilling in ways she had never experienced before. Her technical skills in communications and intelligence analysis remained valuable, but her new role as a policy advocate allowed her to impact the lives of countless people she would never meet. One of the most significant moments in her recovery came when she received a personal letter from General Hayes, who was preparing to retire after a distinguished career. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as Maria was preparing to leave for the weekend. "Dear Miss Santos," the letter began, "as I prepare to conclude my military service, I want you to know that our interaction following your unfortunate experience with Major Thompson has been one of the most meaningful of my entire career. Your dignity under pressure and your commitment to positive change have embodied the highest ideals of public service." The letter went on to describe the broader impact of the policy changes that had grown out of Maria's experience. Similar protections for civilian contractors were being implemented at military installations around the world, and several other countries had requested information about the programs to adapt for their own military structures. "Your willingness to transform personal trauma into institutional improvement has created a legacy that will protect countless people you will never meet," General Hayes concluded. "That is the true measure of heroism, not the absence of fear or pain, but the choice to use those experiences in service of others." Reading the letter, Maria felt a profound sense of completion regarding the ordeal that had begun in Thompson's office months earlier. The humiliation she had endured had been real and painful, but it had also become the foundation for meaningful change that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. The following Monday brought news that Major Thompson's court-martial had concluded with his conviction on charges of abuse of authority and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was sentenced to dismissal from service and forfeiture of benefits, a career-ending punishment that reflected the seriousness of his actions. Maria felt a complex mix of emotions upon hearing the verdict. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also sadness at the waste of a career that could have been dedicated to positive leadership. Thompson's downfall served as a powerful reminder that choices have consequences, especially for those in positions of authority. More importantly, the conviction established a legal precedent that would strengthen future prosecutions of similar cases. Military personnel now understood that abuse of civilian contractors would be taken seriously and prosecuted to the full extent of military law. As autumn turned to winter, Maria's hair had grown back enough to begin resembling her former appearance, though she had chosen a shorter style that reflected her transformed sense of self. The physical evidence of her humiliation was fading, but the inner strength she had developed remained as strong as ever. Her work on the policy implementation team had evolved into a permanent position with expanded responsibilities. She was now recognized as a national expert on military-civilian workplace relations, frequently called upon to consult on cases involving abuse of authority and discrimination. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most to Maria was the steady stream of reports she received about positive changes at installations where the new policies had been implemented. Civilian contractors were reporting improved working conditions, and military personnel were demonstrating greater awareness of appropriate professional boundaries. One particularly meaningful example came from a base in California, where a young woman similar to Maria had faced harassment from a supervisor. Instead of suffering in silence or facing retaliation for reporting the behavior, the woman had been able to use the new reporting procedures to address the situation quickly and effectively. The supervisor had been retrained and transferred, and the woman had continued her career without further incident. These success stories accumulated over time, creating a body of evidence that the changes inspired by Maria's experience were making real differences in people's lives. Each positive outcome served as validation that her decision to fight back had been worthwhile. As the first anniversary of her humiliation approached, Maria found herself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory her life had taken. She had begun that year as a competent but relatively anonymous civilian contractor, focused on building a stable career in intelligence work. She was ending it as a nationally recognized advocate for workplace justice, with a platform to influence policy at the highest levels of military leadership. The transformation had not been without costs. The public attention had been overwhelming at times, and she had struggled with the pressure of being seen as a symbol rather than simply as an individual. There had been moments when she questioned whether the fight had been worth the personal toll it had taken. But as she looked at the letters of gratitude from people whose lives had been improved by the policies she had helped develop, Maria knew that her choice to stand up to Thompson had been the right one. Her humiliation had been transformed into a force for positive change that would outlast any individual career or personal ambition. The young woman who had walked into Thompson's office that morning had been focused on protecting her own position and career. The woman who emerged from that experience had discovered a sense of purpose that transcended personal advancement. She had learned that true strength came not from avoiding adversity, but from choosing how to respond when adversity could not be avoided. As she prepared to face whatever challenges the coming year might bring, Maria Santos carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger. Her hair had grown back, her career had been restored, and her dignity had never really been in question, despite Thompson's attempts to strip it away. Most importantly, she had discovered that her greatest contributions to the world would come not from her technical skills or professional competence, but from her willingness to stand up for principles that mattered. That realization would guide her choices for years to come, long after the immediate crisis had faded into memory. The invitation arrived on official government letterhead on a cold February morning, exactly 1 year after Maria's confrontation with Major Thompson. As she opened the envelope, she could hardly believe what she was reading. The Secretary of Defense was requesting her presence at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., where she would receive the Civilian Service Award, the highest honor that could be bestowed upon a non-military person serving the Department of Defense. The letter explained that her contributions to military-civilian relations and her role in developing policies that had improved workplace conditions across all branches of the military had earned her this unprecedented recognition. Never before had someone received this award for advocacy work that began with their own victimization. Maria set the letter down with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. The ceremony would be attended by the highest levels of military and civilian leadership, and her story would be presented as an example of how individual courage could drive institutional change. The irony was not lost on her that she was being honored in the nation's capital for experiences that had begun with her humiliation in a small office on a military base. The young woman who had her hair forcibly removed as punishment for standing up to authority was now being celebrated by the very institution that had failed to protect her initially. Over the next few weeks, as Maria prepared for the ceremony, she reflected deeply on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The award was gratifying, but it also brought pressure and responsibility that she had not anticipated. She was being positioned as a symbol of successful advocacy, but she knew that her experience was just one example of many stories that remained untold. The media attention surrounding the announcement of her award brought both opportunities and challenges. Reporters wanted to interview her about her experience, and advocacy groups invited her to speak at conferences and events. While she appreciated the platform to discuss important issues, Maria was sometimes uncomfortable with the way her personal trauma was being used to advance broader agendas.